Yeah, well, this has been a really great conference. So kudos to the organizers and the presenters. It's been a long day, everybody's tired, so I'll try to get you out of here by 11 p.m. I won't promise I won't go late. This is when the way I like to do, a quote keynote speech is not to do anything real heavy. So this is not going to be, I'm not going to present a paper, this is not going to be anything real technical. It'll be a little bit more general and provocative and maybe stimulate some ideas and some discussion and really sort of summarize a broader research area and research agenda that I've been involved with rather than discuss specific research findings in great detail. So feel free to jump in, interrupt as we go, and we'll have some time at the end for Q&A, and then we'll conclude this terrific event. So I hope that the Aggie Longhorn Innovation Conference will become a regular event, and maybe we can make it Aggie Longhorn Bear, or maybe Mustang, or whoever else wants to join in our area. I think that'd be great. So I want to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship and innovation and property rights. And a lot of times when people talk about property rights in the context of entrepreneurship, everyone immediately assumes it means patents, okay? And of course it does include patents, but I really have something much more general in mind, because I think there are a lot of super interesting issues about that come out of thinking systematically about ownership, transacting. We've already heard a little bit in our recent discussion about frictions, which is ultimately kind of a property rights idea as well. And so I'm going to try to stimulate your thinking a little bit on how ideas from particularly economics, but also the legal literature on property rights might inform our thinking about entrepreneurship and innovation. So what do I mean by property rights? There's a classic economics literature from the 1960s and 1970s on property rights associated with people like Ronald Coase and Armin Alshin and Harold Demsetz. There's a nice book by Yoram Barzel that summarizes this, what is sometimes called the old property rights tradition, or the Chicago UCLA property rights tradition, which it was really all about actions that trading parties can take, that potential partners can take to more precisely define and protect property rights so that they can be exchanged, right? The famous Coase theorem, right, is all about the ability to alleviate externality problems through defining tradable emissions permits or rights to pollute, for example, that can then be used to internalize externalities. Right? So where property rights are difficult to define and enforce, they are therefore difficult to trade, and therefore it's hard to allow sort of bottom-up market solutions to alleviating those kinds of problems. So this literature is really about, how do we measure things? To what extent are we able to form shared expectations about the value of property rights? What are the characteristics or attributes of resources that might be traded? It's not really about entrepreneurs or really about firms per se. It's a more market level, sort of industry or macro level kind of analysis, but something that's been very influential and important. It's sometimes contrasted with the so-called new property rights economics, although this new property rights economics dates from the 1980s, which seems pretty new to me at my age, but to some of you might seem like we need a newer version of this. But so-called new property rights economics, and that label is meant to distinguish it from the sort of Chicago UCLA approach. This is the idea of firms as collections of incomplete contracts. So the famous Grossman and Hart model of vertical integration is all about how the legal concept of ownership can be used to assign rights and responsibilities to different actors so that they can cooperate in joint production, right? And it places particular emphasis on the characteristics of resources that are used in joint production, the idea of relationship-specific investment, and how certain kinds of rights, residual control rights in particular, need to be assigned in a certain way so that parties will have sufficient incentive to invest in these relationship-specific assets. And the most famous example is from the first paper in this literature by Grossman and Hart, 86, on vertical integration as well as lateral integration. One criticism of this approach, and this is a criticism made by Oliver Williamson in particular, that it's not really about firms per se, it's more about individuals engaged in joint production. So they talk about firms, but the firm is really just sort of a legal fiction here for two or more parties engaged in trade. It's really a theory about which individuals should own which assets so that those individuals are motivated to make adequate investments, optimal investments in relationship-specific capital. But it's also been very influential in my own thinking about entrepreneurship, as I'll point out in just a moment. A third research tradition that is not as well known among entrepreneurship scholars and innovation scholars, which I think deserves to be better known, is what is sometimes called the ownership of enterprise perspective. That name coming from an influential book by Henry Hansman, who's a Yale Law School professor, called The Ownership of Enterprise. And Hansman's project is to evaluate different legal arrangements for organizing firms, for organizing production, right? So, a firm can be organized as a sole proprietorship, or a group of individuals can form a partnership. Some firms are nonprofit as opposed to for-profit firms. The publicly traded corporation, right? The joint stock company is a kind of collaboration among many owners, each of whom has limited decision rights, right? But some important cash flow rights. Hansman came at this perspective actually from doing a study of some less traditional organizational forms, in particular cooperatives. Right, so we have in the US and in many countries around the world, and through over the last 100, 150 years, we have had important examples of firms that were not owned by investors, but were owned by their workers, or owned by consumers, right? Or even owned by suppliers. So there's some, I'm sure in Austin you have some worker-owned grocery co-ops. Talking about California, when I lived in Berkeley, I used to shop at the Berkeley Co-op, which was a worker-owned grocery business. If you buy camping equipment or sports clothes from REI, when you buy something from REI, technically you acquire equity shares in the ownership of REI, which is a consumer-owned firm. A lot of Midwestern ethanol plants are farmer-owned, meaning the farmers who supply the material, the input that is then used to produce ethanol, are actually the owners of the downstream ethanol production plant. So Hansman was trying to figure out under what circumstances do particular organizational forms make sense, right? We could also compare investor-owned companies to government-owned companies, and I'll talk about that in just a second, about innovation. Hansman's theoretical point was that the advantages of these, the relative advantages of different organizational forms are determined largely by a kind of transaction cost, but specifically sort of the cost of negotiating and forming agreements. So if you remember, Hirschman's famous distinction between exit, voice, and loyalty, right? I guess neglect was one, right? So if we disagree, one way that we can resolve our disagreement is I just leave, or you leave. We can dissolve the partnership, right? Or not form an arrangement in the first place, or we can argue it over. We can exercise voice and so sort of shout it out, fight it out until we have some kind of a consensus. Or maybe one of us simply bends to the will of the other as a show of loyalty to the other person or to the group. Hansman made the interesting point that there is one very important advantage of the investor-owned firm over all of the other types that are described in this taxonomy, namely that it's much easier to resolve disputes through exit. In other words, if I'm a shareholder of a company and the shareholders don't agree on some decision that the company would make, I'm not happy about the direction of the company, it's very easy for me to exit simply by selling my shares, especially if these shares are traded in liquid capital markets. Now, maybe we would have said in the past a disadvantage of selling is paying capital gains taxes, but now if you have to pay capital gains taxes even when you don't sell, it doesn't really make a difference. But his point was, cooperatives, for example, it's interesting, why do we only see cooperatives in agriculture? Not exclusively, but almost exclusively in agriculture, in some small grocery businesses, in a few other cases, but not more not more widespread. Even though in most legal systems, including in the US, cooperatives have some advantages. They have some tax advantages. Cooperatives are exempt from antitrust legislation, for example. His argument was, look, it's really hard to resolve disputes in an organization in which you are not only an owner, but also some kind of a patron, right? You're also a customer, or you're also a worker, or you're also a supplier, right? Because then if I exit from a producer-owned cooperative, then I lose my output market, right? If I'm in a worker-owned co-op, I wear one hat as an owner, but then I also wear another hat as an employee, and the cost for me to exit is high because it also involves losing my job. So I may want to stick around and fight quite a bit more. And Hansman argues that the cooperative form really only makes sense in cases where there's a relative homogeneity of interest. So where you don't have that many disputes, right? Everyone is a consumer who has a similar consumption bundle. Every owner is a worker, similar in age profile and objectives and so forth. So for example, if you have co-ops, if you have like agricultural co-ops and a bunch of, Iowa wheat farmers all have similarly sized farms and are at similar life stages and so forth, that cooperative, that ethanol plant will likely work. But if it's spread over a larger geographic area, if you have input suppliers that produce different commodities, some of them are young, some of them are old, they have very different preferences over investment and a lot of other practices in the company, then you're more likely to see disputes, inefficiency, and those firms are less likely to be successful, okay? So what does it have to do with entrepreneurship and innovation? Well, really what I'm trying to get at is the importance of ownership and thinking carefully about ownership in our research areas. Okay, ownership is really important to entrepreneurship and innovation research, and certainly practice as well. Some examples here. Should valuable inputs that are used in production be owned, or should they be rented? The sort of make or buy decision that's been very well studied. Intellectual property is important, of course. How do founders protect their ideas? How should control rights and cash flow rights be allocated among various stakeholders? If we look at financial contracts in VC, right, it's all about the assignment of rights and responsibilities between founders and funders, and there are a lot of complicated ways that we can resolve those problems. Someone earlier today was talking about alliances and collaborations among different investment partners, right? Who should exercise authority under conditions of deep uncertainty, so-called Knightian uncertainty, about which I'll say more in just a second. There's a lot of interesting implications for stakeholder models of the firm, right? Does it make sense to have lots of different parties, lots of different stakeholders, all have a voice in how the firm is operated? One of the advantages of the old shareholder primacy model that is now considered, kind of old-fashioned, is that from the Hansman point of view, right, you have a very homogeneous interest among the owners, maximize return on investment. If the owners who have the decision rights are a heterogeneous group of stakeholders, you're likely to have more conflict, and it becomes more difficult to resolve disputes, okay? However, I claim, here's my bold and provocative thing at 5:51 p.m. when people are too tired to really push back on it. Ownership is under-theorized in the entrepreneurship and innovation literatures. There's a lot of sort of hand-waving and loose mentions of property rights issues, but they're not really thought about as deeply as they could be. For example, residual cash flow rights and residual control rights are very different things and can be separated through a variety of different kinds of contracts, but they're often conflated. Oh, if you're an owner, you make money from the thing and you get to decide how the thing is run. But ownership rights can be shared and partitioned in all kinds of interesting and complicated ways. It's super important for entrepreneurs trying to get private equity. There's confusion between ownership and day-to-day control. Okay, you're the legal owner of the venture, but you've delegated day-to-day decision authority to a hired manager. Well, you're not really the owner. You're not really important. It's really that manager who is important. Well, maybe not, right? Because the decisions of the owner sort of circumscribe the allowable action set of the manager. The owner also can choose who the manager is and can replace the manager. There's sort of a nested hierarchy of decision authority which is not transparent if you just look at who's kind of making decisions day to day. You may miss where the decision authority, the residual decision authority is really housed. And finally, I'm going to claim that there's some confusion between ownership per se, who has the legal ownership claim on a particular asset, and what my colleagues and I are calling ownership competence, which refers to the skill or ability with which ownership is exercised. Now, I think we have mostly econ and finance people in the room. We don't have a lot of like strategy scholars, but in the strategy literature, the idea of competence is super important, right? Or capabilities is another word. Firms have certain organizational capabilities and they have managerial capabilities. We're claiming that there are ownership capabilities as well, and that's something that's relatively new in the strategy literature. So what is a more sophisticated way to think about ownership? Well, I mean, this is borrowed from another presentation, but you can think of ownership is really a bundle of different rights, okay, which sometimes can be separated, but not always, right? So ultimately, at the center of ownership is this notion, two different, sort of families of rights. The right to appropriate residual earnings, in other words, cash flow rights, and the right to make decisions to control the use of the asset. So residual cash flow rights and residual control rights are distinct, although they are often combined, but not always combined. But again, even what does it mean to have control rights over an asset? So, okay, that includes the right to use it, right? So if I own this little slide clicker, I can press the button or not press the button or shoot somebody with a laser or whatever, and you can't tell me, you can't interfere with my right to use the clicker as I want. At the same time, right, I may have, to have full ownership rights, I should also have the right to give it away or sell it, right? And that isn't always the case. For example, to use something that I like to discuss in my class, my kidneys. Okay, so I have full use rights over my kidneys. I can choose to use them or not, right? But in most countries, you don't have alienability rights. You can't sell your kidney, right? You can donate your kidney under certain circumstances, but there's not a market where I can charge whatever price I want for my kidney. I can sell my kidney to the highest bidder. You think it's silly, but actually there's a lot of analysis of how markets for organ transplants might actually improve well-being, improve social welfare, especially for an organ like a kidney, because most of us can actually do okay on one kidney, even though we have two. And there are a lot of people who have kidney failure, who are on kidney dialysis, or who have a life-threatening condition, and they might be willing to pay a lot to have. Their marginal valuation of one of your kidneys may be a lot higher than your marginal valuation of one of your kidneys. And we could have a welfare-enhancing trade if we would allow for that kidney to be transferred without having to go through the bureaucracy, but we don't. Okay? There are also, think about sort of public property, some park or city square here in Austin. We all own it. Okay, well then, actually nobody owns it in the strict sense because you don't have the right to use it whenever you want and however you want. There are certain restrictions that are placed on it. Okay, so the right to use the asset, the right to prevent other people from using it, the right to sell or exchange, the right to transfer your property, all of these are different aspects of ownership that may be present in some cases, but not present in other cases.
Well, I was just going to ask about risk-bearing with relation to ownership, but I was thinking more in terms of like owning a business and who actually has to bear those risks of the business as opposed to someone who's just working for the business. Yeah. And I guess I'm trying to figure out if this is a dimension of ownership that matters in terms of, right. If it's destroyed, who bears the cost of that?
Yeah. So they're closely related, but I mean, you could be an employee without any decision rights, but yet have some kind of variable compensation, performance-based compensation, so that you are bearing some of the cash flow risk, but you don't necessarily have the decision rights that an owner would have, who bears both the income risk, right, but also has those decision rights.
It's just because in
Yeah.
Right? And a lot of the reasons that we don't see that happening, we theorize, is because of the risk bearing. And so, it's just an interesting way of saying that like maybe ownership is partly given through bearing some of the risks in like these performance-based programs.
Yeah, so I mean, I think what you're getting at is, right, I mean, in agency theory, we're looking at a trade-off, typically, right, between providing stronger performance incentives for the agent while yet allocating the distribution of risk in a way such that the less risk-averse party is bearing a higher share of the risks. So that limits the extent to which we want to provide strong performance-based pay for the agent if the agent is more risk-averse than the principal. So we're just sort of balancing that trade-off, but that can be separated from ownership per se, right? Because I could be the owner and yet have a fixed salary and write a contract with you where you get all the residual. I mean, that would be an unusual kind of arrangement, but it's sort of conceptually possible. Of course, I want to come back to firms and not talk about kidneys, but some of the research that I've been doing that I would describe in an entrepreneurship and property rights tradition, starts from the assumption, which is kind of similar to Oliver Hart's formulation, but a little bit richer, I think, that the primary, defining characteristic of ownership, the essence of ownership, what ownership is, right, is the right to make decisions or exercise authority about the use of some productive resources or assets in conditions not specified by prior agreement. Okay, so you econ students and professional economists, in a world of Arrow, DeBrew, complete contingent contracts, I claim, ownership is indeterminate. Ownership does not perform any function. It doesn't matter if I own something or if Kurok owns something, because we can write complete contingent contracts that specify how the resource or asset will be used in every conceivable state of the world. So, I mean, we could call one of us the owner, but it makes no difference in terms of the allocation of resources. It makes no difference in terms of how people act. However, once we allow for the possibility of incomplete contracts or Knightian uncertainty, I'll say more about Knight in just a moment, there's some potential contingencies that could arise that we never anticipated, right, and did not think to write down in our contract. You could argue that, well, maybe we thought about them, but we thought they were sufficiently unlikely that it wasn't worth writing them down. But in either case, Kurok and I now have a contract, say it's over this thing, right? In an Arrow DeBrew world, we can specify how this clicker will be used in every potential set of circumstances, so it really doesn't matter whose name we put on it. But in a world of Knightian uncertainty and incomplete contracts, let's say we've got a contract that says Kurok gets to use it Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I get to use it Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. We alternate on Sundays, or maybe we take Sundays off. You can't point the laser in somebody's eye, but you can use it to give a talk. We have some rules written down about how the thing can be used. Okay, but then, another classroom example, what if it's like the zombie apocalypse? And despite how many movies and TV shows there are about zombies, we didn't think that could actually happen. So there's nothing in the contract that says, how can the clicker be used in the event of a zombie apocalypse? Right? Can you laser the zombie in his eye and stop the zombie? Can you throw it at the zombie? Can you use it as a weapon, to kill the zombie? We didn't write that down. We didn't specify that because none of us thought that a zombie apocalypse could happen. So what do we do now? If the rule is in circumstances, under the zombie apocalypse or in some other circumstances not specified by prior agreement, Peter has to get Kurok's permission to kill a zombie with the clicker. Okay, then Kurok is in fact the owner. That's what ownership is. It's the right to fill in those gaps in the incomplete contracts. Question?
I was just thinking about how this relates to the Post theorem. It's not identical, but it's very related in terms of well-defined property rights.
Yeah. So think of it as a missing market, if you want, or yeah. So the way Frank Knight conceives of this is, again, this idea that people don't act under uncertainty in sort of a rational way by formulating a probability distribution and maximizing expected value, whatever, but rather they rely on a kind of intuition or gut instinct because they're not able to articulate and formulate. They can't imagine all possible future states of the world. They can't assign probabilities to those. Therefore, in a world like that, you need to have some rules or practices for what happens in various cases, and that's really what ownership does. Notice ownership rights can be shared among individuals, right, through contract. They can be partially delegated, but not fully delegated. In other words, I can tell Kurok, this is my clicker, but you can decide how to use it, in normal circumstances. But I can't give Kurok the right to decide when that contract can be changed and still be the owner, right? So is this a kind of like ultimate residual at the end of the day, as the expression attributed to President Truman, the buck stops here. The place where the buck stops is ownership, right? So the only way I can give to Kurok my residual decision rights is by making him the owner. In other words, by selling the asset to him. Some stuff that I've been working on for, I guess, almost a decade now on Knight's concept of entrepreneurial judgment is the idea that really what entrepreneurs are in the business of doing is, making these forecasts or conjectures or formulating beliefs, expectations about the uncertain future and then acting upon them. In fact, I think I've got So Knight uses the word judgment to describe this faculty of the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur judges the future in a way that may be idiosyncratic and tacit and different from how other people judge the future. So some of us have taken to calling this the judgment-based approach to entrepreneurship. I wrote a book with Nikolai Foss called Organizing Entrepreneurial Judgment that summarizes some of this literature. And one point that I want to make in just a few minutes is, again, that ownership is not the same thing as ownership ability. And I have a paper that I'll talk about with the rather parsimonious title, Ownership Competence, that tries to explain this notion of ownership competence. Okay, so back to Knight. So there's Frank Knight up there with this eye shade. The sort of judgment-based approach that's largely inspired by Knight and other writers emphasizes uncertainty, right, which is not the same as probabilistic risk in Knight's formulation. It also emphasizes that resources are complex and heterogeneous, and also that you need some sort of competitive mechanism for sorting, for assigning ownership titles to parties with varying levels of ownership competence. I'll talk about that in just a minute. An easy way to conceive of judgment, although I'm going to challenge it in just a second, is this idea of decision-making without a formal model or rule. Decision-making about the future in the absence of a formal decision rule. Maximize expected value given the following distribution is an example of a decision rule, but there could be others. Again, we often use words like intuition or gut instinct. The Germans have a great word for this, Verstehen, which is usually translated into English as understanding. But it's like a much more deep sort of fundamental knowledge of some phenomenon. Do we have any Germans in here? Any German speakers can correct me on this? Okay. So Verstehen is a good idea of sort of conceptualizing what Knight thinks entrepreneurs have, what he thinks entrepreneurs do. But to link this back to ownership, there's a famous quote from Knight's book, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, which reads as follows: "The only risk," in scare quotes, because it's not really risk, which leads to a profit is a unique uncertainty resulting from an exercise of ultimate responsibility which in its very nature cannot be insured, nor capitalized, nor salaried." Okay, so what generates profits for firms outside of some kind of general equilibrium, right, is these unique idiosyncratic uncertainties that cannot be parameterized or insured against. You've probably heard Knightian uncertainty described as uninsurable risk. See, the finance people are nodding here, so I'm on solid ground. As opposed to insurable risk, right? But what I find interesting in this quotation is the part that I've highlighted here. So to realize profit, right? It's not just that the entrepreneur is formulating some beliefs about the future using gut instinct or Verstehen, but also acting upon them, right? So to earn a profit, you have to exercise ultimate responsibility, and it's that ultimate responsibility that cannot be salaried or capitalized or insured. It's like my thing with Kurok and the clicker, right? The decision about how to use the clicker during the zombie apocalypse, right? That is the thing that ownership establishes, right? The owner is the party that gets to bear that ultimate responsibility. You know, the buck stops with the owner. So this really comes out of risk, uncertainty, and profit, though I think it's not not the best known sort of part in Knight's book. And as I mentioned before, you know, proximate authority, which is distinct from residual authority, certainly can be delegated to a large extent, right, to professional managers and other parties. One of my favorite quotes from a German economist, not very well known today, named Ludwig Lachmann, in a book on capital structure. He says the following: "We are living in a world of unexpected change, i.e. Knightian uncertainty, right? Hence capital combinations, resource combinations, will be ever changing, will be dissolved and reformed. In this activity, we find the real function of the entrepreneur." So the real function of the entrepreneur in this world of resource heterogeneity and complexity and Knightian uncertainty, uninsurable risks, the real function of the entrepreneur is to figure out these resource combinations, right? To acquire control of, combine, recombine resources in the pursuit of creating and capturing value and realizing an economic profit. That's really what entrepreneurs do in this perspective. Okay, one example of why Knightian uncertainty might be interesting and worth thinking about. So it's been correctly pointed out that what is it that owners actually have ownership of? What is the property title? What is it that the property title gives you? So Demsetz famously argued, and Barzell as well, that really what ownership gives you the right to certain attributes of a resource rather than the physical resource itself. It's the things that you can do with the resource that are specified by your ownership claim, right? That's like enforceable in court. And I mean, I think there's a lot of insight into thinking about the relationship between the asset itself and the attributes of the asset. But what I think Demsetz and Barzell miss is that what do you do about attributes that have not yet been discovered or conceptualized or created at the time that the contract is written? Right? So a contract can't give you ownership of attributes that are unknown at the time the contract is written. So we've got to have some way of figuring out, again, it's like the zombie apocalypse, right? So we discover that this clicker can also be used to kill zombies. That's a new attribute of the clicker. The old attributes being advancing the slides and, pointing at a point on the slides or, feeling good in your hand or whatever. So if I own the clicker, I have ownership of all those uses. But what about uses that emerge later? You need some mechanism for assigning ownership of those new yet undiscovered attributes. And so we argue that that's where ownership of the tangible asset comes in, the physical asset. You get all the attributes that you can contract for at the time, but you also get the right to the new attributes that come along later.
So throughout all this, we're thinking of, say, the government's enforcement of property rights as being sort of held fixed, or is that itself?
Sorry, repeat the first part. So what am I assuming about government?
When you're sort of discussing...
Yeah, we're assuming, so if property rights are well-defined and well-enforced, we can sort of trace through the implications of what that system would look like. We can, of course, imagine cases where property rights are not clearly defined, are not well enforced, right? So then we have additional transaction costs. That's what like the old property rights economics is all about. How much is it worth spending to figure that out? So one of Demsetz's famous examples is, barbed wire, right? So, when the North American continent was first colonized by Europeans, right, it wasn't worth drawing lines and surveying on a map and putting a fence around some huge place where your cattle are grazing, maybe say in Texas, if there's hardly any people there, right? And so it really doesn't matter who owns which piece of land because there's plenty of land to go around. We can all let our cattle run around. In other words, that's a case where property rights were kind of undefined because it wasn't worth defining them. The costs, the transaction costs, and like the cost of building fences exceeded on the margin the additional benefits that would be yielded from me being able to keep your cattle off of my land, right? When that situation changed, as cattle become more valuable, as population density increases, and as the cost of fencing goes down, then we see people going to the courthouse and staking out their claim for this piece of land that they say they own, and then going and installing a fence and so forth. So yeah, enforcement is partly endogenous to the benefits of enforcement. I should say definition and enforcement. It's kind of beyond the scope here, but I mean, you might also imagine there are alternative enforcement mechanisms besides state enforcement. Maybe there's some kind of private ordering solution, there's some kind of negotiation, or there's reputation. There's a famous study by Robert Ellickson, who's also a Yale law professor, where he sort of criticizes Coase, and he says that the mechanism described by Coase in the Coase theorem paper, right, that we resolve that what was, it's the railroad sparks are going on to the property of the farmer and damaging the farmer's crops. So, you either have Pigouvian taxes, or Coase says it's better if you let them negotiate, they can buy and sell the rights to emit the sparks and reach an efficient solution. Ellickson pointed out that in reality, that's not the way most of these disputes are settled. They're usually settled informally by custom or by consensus. Again, the local village, your cattle go onto my land. We don't actually write a contract and buy and sell property rights. We go to the village elders and they say, this is the way we've always done it in our village, and that's the way you're going to do it. So it may be that you don't actually need formal definition and enforcement all of the time. Maybe custom or something else can be a substitute. So, okay. So now I'll just say some wild and crazy stuff before we wrap up here. Something else I've been working on is trying to understand better how entrepreneurs persuade other actors, stakeholders if you want, to sort of join them in the venture. So I got to state this carefully because I got into a problem with some journal reviewers on this. A literal and not very wise reading of Knight's Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, right, might imply that, well, gosh, if entrepreneurial judgments about the future are tacit and idiosyncratic, then how does the entrepreneur convince anybody else to join her in this crazy venture, right? Because no one else is going to have the same beliefs about the future, and it's going to be very hard for the entrepreneur to persuade other input suppliers, to attract workers and capital suppliers, investors, and so forth. Therefore, all firms should just be like, sole proprietorships, right? Obviously, that's not the case. Or I should say, new ventures should all be like bootstrapped, right? You should have to self-fund, because what investor would be crazy enough to give you any capital when your vision of the future is so idiosyncratic and you can't write it down in terms of formal decision rules and so forth? Obviously, that's not the world in which we live. So there must be some way that entrepreneurs are able to overcome the challenges posed by Knightian uncertainty and enroll. In the entrepreneurship literature, they talk about enrolling and engaging external stakeholders, convincing other people to join the party, whether they're investors or workers or whatever. So here's an interesting way to think about Knightian uncertainty. Sorry, I thought I had another. Okay, yeah, is to say, okay, what if we say the following? What does it mean for Knightian uncertainty to be present? So textbook answer, undergraduate answer, no offense undergraduates, is, okay, if you can write down a function, then it's probabilistic risk. If you can't, then Knightian uncertainty is present. End of story. Okay, what if we change that a little bit and say, okay, what if I, as the entrepreneur, I believe that I'm operating in a world of probabilistic risk. Okay, if you ask me what do I think is going to happen tomorrow, I will write down the function for you. I can tell you there are 10 possible things that can happen tomorrow, and they happen with the following probabilities, and that's the way I view the world. In my mind, I'm dealing with a world of probabilistic risk. Okay? Now, I go to one of you, and I say, hey, who wants to join this adventure? And I tell you all about my ideas, and you say, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. No one would ever buy that product. Right? There's no way this could possibly be correct. This distribution you're telling me about, it's nuts. I don't believe it whatsoever. Okay? Then I might as well be operating in a world where I don't have a distribution in my head. Right? In other words, what characterizes Knightian uncertainty, it's not, to use philosophical jargon, it's not ontological. Knightian uncertainty is not about, it's not something about how the world really is. It's more epistemological or interpersonal, right? Knightian uncertainty is that which makes it difficult for me to get somebody else to share the same view of the future or mental model, if you like, that I have. So I've got this one paper where we're working on trying to lay out some different ways that entrepreneurs try to overcome these sort of communication barriers. Right, so what if we interpret Knightian uncertainty, again, as that which makes it difficult to form intersubjective agreement on what's likely to happen in the future? Okay. Well, obviously we know that entrepreneurs, at least in some cases, are able to accomplish that because we have lots of externally funded ventures, we have lots of team-based ventures, we have lots of skilled employees joining new ventures unless there's a flood. And so there must be something that we can do in the market to sort of work this out. And so I've got this one paper we're working on trying to articulate some means by which they do that that are different from just sort of the standard signaling and screening mechanisms you get in financial contracting literature. There's a lot of work on intersubjective communication, on things like storytelling and narratives. Reference points is that's the way Oliver Hart describes these things nowadays. Impression management, being able to empathize with other parties or take the perspective of other parties as an example. Even ingratiating yourself to other parties by saying things that you don't really believe, but you think they want to hear. That can backfire if the other parties believe that it's ingratiating. Something else I meant to say and forgot to put on the slide. The entrepreneur may also revise her own beliefs about the future in the process of engaging with potential stakeholders. So there's a kind of a self-learning that can also be part of this process. So we discussed some of these mechanisms in a paper which I can send you if you want. But there may be cases where it's just not feasible or it's not cost effective to achieve any kind of shared mental model or shared cognition. Therefore, the entrepreneur has to look for other mechanisms to engage the participation of external parties without them having to share the beliefs or think that the entrepreneur's beliefs are reasonable. And normally we say, oh, well, we can just write contracts that will take care of that, right? We put in milestones, we tranche the funding, we put in a founder replacement clause and other things that give, say, if we're talking about capital markets, they give external funders all these visual decision rights. Then they're going to be willing to invest, even if they're not confident that the entrepreneur's mental model of the future is reasonable. But I mean, as we point out, that can have some impact, not just on the sort of effort incentives of the agent, of the entrepreneur, that's something that's been studied a lot, but also on the entrepreneur's ability to exercise judgment in cases of unanticipated future contingencies. Because what some of these contracts essentially do is they take the entrepreneurial function, the judgment function, away from the founder, and they're sort of giving it to the VC or the angel. And so now the founder really has her hands tied and is not able to exercise her entrepreneurial function to its fullest extent. Yes?
So just add on to the property rights question you asked earlier. So can we think of cryptos under this framework?
Can we say again?
Can we think of cryptos
Yeah.
under this framework where the blockchain could be the
Sure.
contracting mechanism that removes all this uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, we talked earlier about innovations that reduce frictions. So are there innovations that can reduce frictions that make it difficult to establish shared communication or reliability or trust? Yeah, I mean, to the extent that blockchain alleviates the need for third-party intervention, I mean, so in my mind, blockchain is sort of alternative contracting technology, right? But I don't know that it necessarily resolves the problem of how we deal with unanticipated future contingencies. It just means there's more transparency about what the contract is and whether the contract is being enforced or not. So, yeah, that's a good question. Okay, yeah. So this idea that that ownership is not just something you inherit from your wealthy, parents or grandparents, and you just kick back and let the money come in. I mean, ownership in the way that we're describing it, ownership is residual control, residual decision rights over productive assets in circumstances of naughty and uncertainty, right? I mean, that is an economic function, just like labor, right? Or any number of other functions, and it can be performed with greater or lesser ability. This idea, insight actually comes from Alshin and an old Alshin article on property rights. Alshin says, people differ in their talents as owners. Ownership ability includes attitude toward risk-bearing, knowledge of different people's productive abilities, foresight, and of course, judgment. So there's this notion of judgment coming back into play. So one, I should say, a difficulty that I've run into is with the word judgment. Because if you think about it, okay, so the formal definition of judgment that you get out of Knight is judgment is the act of making these decisions under conditions of uncertainty. The problem is in the English language, the word judgment is also used in a different way, right? To connote wisdom or prudence or experience, right? We want you to render a judgment. It doesn't mean just make a decision. It means make a wise decision, right? Using all your experience and skill. So what we mean by judgment in the very formal sense is simply this act of making these decisions. You could be an entrepreneur who exercises judgment, and you could stink at it. You could be really bad at exercising judgment. So judgment per se is not the same thing as good judgment, right? So what we're trying to articulate with this notion of ownership competence is that, we're kind of running out of time here, but a lot of the phenomena we're interested in competitive markets, right, and in markets for entrepreneurial finance and so forth, it's some kind of a sorting mechanism for trying to get ownership titles in the hands of parties who are higher in ownership competence than others. I mean, if you think about the Coase theorem, right? I mean, the simple way to explain the Coase theorem is it's an argument that if property rights are tradable, then property rights are just like any other valuable resource. In a competitive system, we expect resources to sort of flow towards their highest value users, right? So if a property right is an asset in that sense, it's going to tend to flow into the hands of the party that can best exercise that property right in a way that creates value or whatever. That's essentially what the Coase theorem is saying. So a lot of our understanding of productivity growth and technological innovation is really about this process of getting the right owners in the right places, okay? And so this article that came out earlier this year by myself and some colleagues that tries to introduce this construct of ownership competence lays out this argument in more detail. We try to separate ownership competence into different components, what we call governance competence, the skill with which you manage the assets you currently own, matching competence, the skill with which you figure out which assets you could own. I'm forgetting now, where did that come up this morning? Oh, the paper on it was your paper, right? Whose paper was it on investment officers? Yeah, it was yours. Yeah, on female.
It's loan.
Loan officers, yes, sorry. So really, the question there is, are you good at, so governance competence in your setting would be, I'm able to get my loan officers to be productive and efficient. Matching competence would be, I know which loan officers are a good match for me. Who should I have working under me and who should I not? Right? And then timing competence is knowing when to make changes in the matching arrangement. I'll skip the details just to make one last point and then I'll wrap up here. So I want to say something about public policy, about government ownership. Again, if it's late in the day and I can say stuff and get away with it and I can leave, you can't get me. I think what a lot of us would, so our basic understanding of how entrepreneurship and innovation works is that, okay, look, we don't want the government picking technologies and picking individuals and picking firms and picking industries. We want the government to establish an institutional environment characterized by protection of property rights and the rule of law and free markets and so forth. From that, entrepreneurship will emerge, and that entrepreneurship will yield innovations, and those innovations will yield economic growth. Some people have argued, especially in the last 10 years or so, that this sort of standard, what I think is of a standard model, kind of downplays the important role of the public sector in fostering innovation and economic growth. So Mariana Mazzucato's book, The Entrepreneurial State, was sort of a path-breaking book in terms of the influence of this idea. She argues that a lot of the important technological breakthroughs, maybe most of them, that we all take for granted today really didn't come purely from market actors, but were the result of wise investments and R&D programs and so forth that were done by public actors and public agencies. Her latest book that she just came out with this year is a call for the reestablishment of old-style industrial policy, like 1950s style industrial policy. And so you see a lot of popular literature making these kinds of claims, and there was a Mazzucato headline, the thing that was, I think it's a couple months ago in the Boston Review, why we should go back to having the heavy hand of the state in allocating resources across industries. There's a lot that can be said about that, and I've said it on other occasions, but I'll just make one point here before we wrap up, as it relates to ownership and property rights. So, a couple points. One is we need to distinguish between sort of government sponsorship, public dollars being used for something, and government ownership or control, or like public actors are actually doing the innovation, doing the entrepreneurship. This one paper I'm working on, we use this kind of a taxonomy, right? So the sponsor is who pays for it, right? The executor is who actually does it. And so, in the top left box, we've got, private sector R&D, it's funded by venture capitalists, retained earnings, whatever, funded by capital markets, and private actors are doing the work. In the bottom right-hand corner, you have government research facilities and research facilities at public universities funded by public funds and so forth. So we've done quite a lot of study, we as a profession, of what goes on in the top left-hand box and the bottom right-hand box. Where we've done a lot less work is on the off-diagonals, right? So, and the evidence here is kind of mixed. So we actually know a fair amount about the top right box because there's a lot of literature on various public programs to subsidize private sector innovation and entrepreneurship. And the evidence, as I'm sure a lot of you know, it's mixed at best. Josh Lerner has written a lot of papers with colleagues about SBIR and various attempts to incentivize small business and high-tech business, mostly finding that the programs have not been very successful. There's some literature on how public funding can sometimes crowd out private funding of private projects. There's an interesting paper by Goolsbee who argues that the main beneficiaries of publicly funded science are scientists who capture most of those gains in terms of higher wages and better perks, but that it doesn't actually give you more or better science than you would have gotten in the absence of that funding. I claim that we actually know very little about the lower left-hand box, right? What about public agencies that are doing innovation and entrepreneurship using private dollars? And you say, well, that sounds kind of weird. Well, you can imagine a private university, or say that us as private actors, right, employed at whatever kind of university on a government grant. I work at Baylor, which is a private university. If I have an NSF, then I'm essentially in this lower left-hand box. And anyway, so I'm actually working on a project that looks at a Brazilian public agency called the Fiocruz Foundation. Do we have any Brazilians? Which is the largest scientific research facility in Brazil. It's publicly owned. It's part of the Brazilian state, loosely speaking. But its scientists do a lot of research funded by private companies and by private foundations. So they're public executors of privately sponsored research. And essentially what we find, at least in our preliminary results, is that funding per se is not the most important determinant of outcomes. It's the way funding sources combined with other attributes of the project, like the number of different funding sources the project draws upon, the type of, these are this mostly biopharma research, the characteristics of the project, like what kind of disease are you trying to attack with this treatment or this therapy, and also the composition of the research team. So public funding tends to work well when you have a superstar scientist leading the research team. It works less well in the absence of a star scientist. So anyway, now we're done. I claim that property rights and ownership are important in entrepreneurship and innovation research, not just patents, but a bunch of other stuff. You know, and again, this notion that ownership really matters under conditions of night and uncertainty is something I think we need to explore a little bit more. What to own, how to own, when to change ownership are sort of key themes here. And I think turning back to the public-private issue, and this came up in some earlier discussions today, Vish in his talk about these competing innovation projects. Are there big advantages to decentralization and competition? And I think the more we centralize R&D, whether it's through industrial policy or other kinds of big top-down programs, you know, we lose the benefits of competition and experimentation that historically have provided very good outcomes in terms of innovation and economic growth. So thank you very much for your attention.